My name is Ashish Kothari. I'm sitting in Pune right now. I work with a organization called Kalpavriksha, which is a 42-year-old environmental action group that I helped to start when I was in high school in New Delhi. I'm also involved with many other national and global networks working on development issues, livelihoods issues, environment, and on alternatives, including the Vikalp Sangam process in India, which is a confluence of alternatives, and the global tapestry of alternatives, which is working worldwide, trying to bridge different sorts of movements of alternatives around the world. Actually, since the last 4 decades that we've been working on the interface between what is called development and environment and livelihoods and so on, we've realized that most of what we call development is actually extremely destructive. It is violent it is violence against nature in many different forms, but it is also violence against communities, especially those who are most dependent on land and forests and water for their livelihoods and their survival. And so, this instead of this kind of development, what we are arguing for is alternative forms of well-being, where communities are the ones who lead the process. They are the ones who take decisions. They are the ones who actually talk about what is sustainable, what is the kind of livelihoods they want, how do they relate to the earth and to other species. And in that sense, it is a radical form of democracy, in the sense that people are at the center of decision making. It's not only politicians and bureaucrats, but people everywhere, wherever they are, in villages and towns and so on. But it is also a form of democracy which is responsible towards the earth, towards the planet, towards other species. So therefore, radical ecological democracy. Or in other words, in India, we can also call it some form of Swaraj or eco-Swaraj, because when Mahatma Gandhi spoke about Swaraj, he was also talking about the autonomy, the freedom to take decisions as an individual, as a community, as a country, but with responsibility towards other people and other communities, and also towards the rest of nature. So in that sense, eco-Swaraj is another term that we use. Well, the Sustainable Development Goals, when they came in and were accepted by all countries in 2015, they're a significant improvement over their earlier avatar, which was the Millennium Development Goals, because they've brought in much more squarely the issues of equality and environmental conservation and so on. But there are fundamental flaws in it. For instance, it is still very heavily based on economic growth, and we feel that economic growth-based development is actually not sustainable. You can't have continuous growth of materials and energy on a finite planet. That's very clear now. You can see it with what's happening with the climate, what's happening with biodiversity loss, and so on. So what we need is, we need elements of the SDG framework definitely for India in terms of gender justice, sustainable consumption and production and things like that. But we need to go beyond that and talk about much more radical forms of transformation of the kind that I mentioned. Just to give you one or two other sort of quick examples. So in central India, the Adivasis, the indigenous peoples, have reclaimed their collective rights to the forest that they live within, and through that also enhance their livelihoods, protecting the forest and so on. Or you can take example from urban areas where urban neighborhoods are claiming that they should be part of the city planning. Why should only the planning happen through bureaucrats and politicians? That each one of us is part of that, and so whether it's budgets or it's what's going to happen in my neighborhood, we should be a part of that also. So those forms of direct decision making, ecologically responsible decision making and so on, go beyond the SDG framework, and that's what I think India needs to be headed towards. Well, I mean, with the SDGs, as I've said, that there are some good elements, but we have to go beyond that. In terms of India and China and the climate commitments, I think there are two or three very important components here. We know, of course, that historically India and China have not been responsible for the climate crisis. It is countries of the West that have been responsible. But now India and China are amongst the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases on the planet. And so therefore, we do also have a global responsibility in terms of the climate crisis. But equally important is the fact that we argue for the West, for Western countries to pay reparation costs to the rest of the, to the global South for all the historical damage that they have done. But as important is India's role within the country itself. Who, for instance, are the, if you look at 50 million, 100 million Indians, people like us who are rich, we are actually the biggest consumers of, let's say, the climate, or the biggest polluters, or the biggest destroyers of the environment, right? And it's the poor who suffer the most. So there has to be some kind of just like we ask for north-south equality, there also has to be equality within the country between the poor and the rich, where the rich needs to take much more responsibility for their actions that are destroying the climate. The West is not doing nearly enough to meet its commitments, and there are two aspects there. One is the West, rich people everywhere, but especially in Western countries, have to significantly scale down their material and energy consumption. They are consuming way too much of the earth, much more than their per capita share should be, right? So one is what is sometimes called degrowth within their own countries and their own regions. And the second very important thing is that they have to pay not as charity, but as reparation, as compensation for the past damage and continuing damage that they're doing to the Earth's climate and biodiversity and all of that, even things like toxic elements, etc. So if you look at the last 400-500 years of the kind of damage the West has done to the Earth as a whole, and the consequences on poor people everywhere on the planet, it is recognizing that and then saying, okay, we're sorry, and here is our reparation, where we will pay you for the kind of adaptation and mitigation and responses that you as in the global South need to make. So it is these two roles that the West has to pay, and so far it's done a very bad job of both. I think there's a lot of hope. I think these new youth movements, whether they're working on climate or on other environmental issues or on social issues, on casteism, on gender, many different things young people are working on, that they have a certain, not just an enthusiasm and an energy, which is very important, but they're also willing to learn from the past. They're willing to be more comprehensive in their approach, not just tunnel vision that it's only environment, it's nothing else, or it's only social justice, nothing else. So I think that attempt, and being able to relate to people like us who have a certain understanding of the history of what has happened in India, is creating and will hopefully create more and more of the possibility of young people taking the leadership in getting us out of the mess that unfortunately previous generations, including ours, have created.